Hi, it's Catherine here, the author of TORIANA, and I'm going to be bringing you the next chapter. It's chapter 15, and it's called The Granddaughter. Honor widows who are truly widows, but if a widow has children or grandchildren, let them first show godliness to their own household. 1 Timothy chapter 5, verses 3 to 4. I loved my gran very much, and I desperately wanted to be by her side as she lay in hospital. Thank the Lord there was a MAF flight available that could take me to Uganda, from where I could fly to South Africa. I felt like the sand that usually flows through a timer was stuck. Time seemed to stand still. I prayed that God would keep her alive so I could see her and take care of her. He heard my prayer, and as I rushed through the hospital doors in Cape Town, I found she was still alive but frail. I rushed to her bedside, gently held her hand, and our eyes met, and we embraced. She had completed her course of antibiotics and was out of danger, thankfully, and she desperately wanted to return home to her little cottage. I agreed with the doctors and care nurses at her old age home that I would take care of her. Her breathing was still labored, and I had to keep her with a mask and oxygen and medicine that would keep loosening her lungs and help her to breathe. I cooked meals she loved, and I cherished this time of being with her. After 2 days of helping her, I was exhausted, but I knew I still wanted to share the message of God's love and His salvation with her. So we sat together and I went through the message, and we discussed all her questions about God. Then there was silence for a while, and she asked me, "Kath, where do you think Grandpa is?" "I want to be with him." My eyes welled up with tears as I explained to her that only God knew if Grandpa was in heaven or not, but one thing I knew was that I wanted to see her in heaven one day. Then we got to the point of forgiveness, and I asked her if she had forgiven my mother for divorcing her son, my dad. I had been through the process of forgiving my mum and loving her, but I knew my gran was not at that point. I explained to her that if she did not forgive my mum, God would not forgive her. I also shared with her that I had seen over the years how bitterness and hurt was affecting my gran, because of her continually not wanting to forgive. My gran said she would pray as we trusted God to help her with forgiving my mum. That night, I went to bed with peace and hoping that God would work a miracle between my gran and my mum. At 2 a.m., I woke up in the morning with a very high fever, my head spinning and my back aching. I had had malaria so many times that I knew this was malaria. In my rush to get to my gran from South Sudan, I did not bring my malaria medicine with me, but I knew I needed it for my life. My only option was to phone my mum, as I knew my gran was too weak to help. My mum saw the situation as urgent and rushed to my gran's home. I didn't want to scare my gran, but I needed to let her know that my mum was coming. I called the sister on duty at my gran's old age village, and I asked her to please come and take care of my gran. As the sister arrived, so did my mum, and she rushed me to hospital. I was feverish and I could not think, as I felt my whole body was being speared. I cried out to God to help me, and I couldn't understand why He allowed me to get malaria at this critical time of my gran's health. Doctors surrounded me with needles and drips to bring my fever down. And then I had to wait for the blood test results, and when they came back positive malaria, which meant they would allow me to start the malaria medicine. After taking the first dose of medicine, I still felt terrible, and I knew it would take time for me to recover. My mum brought me back to my gran's and decided to remain to take care of me as well as my gran. As I lay in bed, weak and exhausted, I heard my gran and my mum chatting in the sitting room. It was then that I realized that God works all things for the good of those who love Him. My sickness and malaria had caused my mum to come into my gran's home, and we both needed my mum's help. Through this time, the bitterness fell away from my Gran's heart, like petals falling from a flower. God was restoring and healing in more ways than I ever dreamt or imagined. I lay in bed with a thankful heart, knowing that my Gran had forgiven my mum. Not out of fear, but because God had softened their hearts and was working His salvation in their lives. I felt we were all in His hands and He was holding us together with His love. As I gained strength, so did my Gran, and soon my mum was free to return to her home. Before I realized I had malaria, I had bought a book that simply and clearly explained salvation to those that wanted it. I read the book with my Gran, and then she turned to me with her hand on my leg, and she said she had forgiven my mum, and that she was ready to pray the prayer of commitment to Jesus with me. When it came time for me to return to my work in South Sudan, I felt comforted by the fact that Gran had some Christian friends. She had started attending the Methodist Church in Fishhook and really enjoyed Pastor Ronnie's sermons. He has been a faithful pastor to my Gran, and when she is weak and can't get to church, he comes to visit her. He loves sport, so they have a good natter about sport, and then he reads her some scriptures and serves her communion. She often told me before she goes to sleep, she says her prayers, and she prayed for me and God's plans for me as I return back into South Sudan.